and thank you for joining us for episode 5 of our Overshadowed series, discussing how modern IT and security teams are dealing with the risks of shadow IT. I'm Russ Spitler, CEO and co-founder of Nudge Security, and with me today is Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Epiphany Systems. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hey, Russ, thanks.
So today we'll be talking about the counterbalancing forces of risk and friction in security, a core design principle that we've kept front and center at Nudge Security. Malcolm, when we were talking before, it sounded like this has really been a big focus for you during the course of your career. But before we jump in, could you give us a quick overview of your background and work at Epiphany?
Yeah. So I have been with Epiphany for a couple of years, and we actually just merged with a managed security provider that we were sister companies with called Revealed. So we're in the process of doing all those changes. But prior to that, I most notably was at Silence as Chief Security and Trust Officer, working for Stuart McClure, the CEO and co-founder. And then previous to that, I was at Intel for 24 years, straight out of graduate school, business roles for 10, 11 years. And then I tripped my way into security almost 22 years ago after 9/11 and after Code Red and NIMDA. And Andy Grove, running Intel still at the time, was frankly beating the crap out of the CIO to deal with the availability risk issues. And he had asked me to come in and run security business continuity. And that led me putting my arms around basically all aspects of things and eventually became Chief Security and Privacy Officer worldwide.
That's incredible. And what a fun time to get introduced to security. I can only imagine what it must be like to have Andy Grove breathing down your neck. But as we kind of started with, love to drill into what you look at when you think about implementing security programs and how you kind of define friction as it relates to security programs and implementing them at scale.
Yeah, so I've always had this view that, being a former finance person and somebody who ran, finance for $1 billion business unit and helped start a few business units at Intel. When I got into security, I was like, what is the business outcome that Intel needs, the shareholders need from me? Spending money on security doesn't add to the net income of the business, right? It's a risk management type thing. So I was like, okay, a good security solution will create a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk. Primary job, reduce risk. A great security solution will do that and lower my total cost of controls, because there's a cost of control, not only the direct spend of the solution, the time, the effort, but it fans out across IT and sometimes the business unit. And then my mythical hero solution did both of those things, but would reduce control friction, because control friction is not immutable. It's something that we can design towards or design away from. And in a high control friction environment, I always found at Intel, being in a high-tech industry, but I think this is by and large true in most organizations, in a high control friction environment, one of two states occurs. People will either adhere to the control, and if it causes too much friction, it creates a systemic business risk, slows product development, slows time to market, slows productivity. That is a systemic business risk because it affects the P&L. Or they'll say, screw you, security folks, and they'll go around the control. In which case, you spend money on a control to theoretically control for risk that people are going around. And then we call it shadow IT, or we blame the user because they're just trying to get their job done. And we've made it hard for them to get their job done, so they ignore the control. And then we blame them, and then we buy another solution, and then the cycle continues. So my mythical hero would always do one of those three things. And if I could go to the business and say, give me $1 million, and I'm going to deploy a solution that is going to bend the curve of risk down, lower the company's total cost of controls, and improve business velocity, I mean, what CFO is not going to say yes to that?
It's so refreshing to hear people have such a considered perspective around that end user experience. Because I do feel as though for a long time, we've taken a lot of security controls and just sort of said, hey, this is a new chink in our armor. It's going to happen. And, our end user is going to deal with it. But you're absolutely right. The effectiveness of that control is defined by compliance with end users, and that user experience is such a key defining aspect of that.
Yeah, to me, it's always been a design and architectural element. And again, I've said for a long time, most of the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. They make money the more risk that occurs. Well, guess what? If I sell you a solution that generates a risk issue because it creates friction and then causes the user to go around, guess what? I can sell you another solution to deal with that problem too. So economically, the vendor community has never taken a major design focus on that user experience. And on the internal aspects, we've always just said it's a trade-off between productivity and security. And I'm like, no, when you trade off, it's like a balance beam. One goes up, one goes down. That's when you start framing things that way, you're automatically sub-optimizing. To me, it's more like an optimization problem, a calculus equation. I got to maximize the coefficients of each thing. How do I maximize the security benefit? How do I maximize the user productivity? How do I minimize the total cost to the environment?
When you put it that way, I might have to revisit my business model here, Malcolm. But let's take it down a notch. And obviously, can you give us an example of a program where that risk friction balance was out of whack in sort of the favor of friction and sort of what you saw as the trade-off and consequences of that?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a couple examples, and they're real ones. I've written about them, talked about them before. So again, go back 20 plus years ago when I landed running security. Again, you're starting to do massive hygiene initially. And guess what? I had an authorization from Andy Grove. I didn't care about the friction I created. We pushed patches to systems and gave users 30 seconds to save what they could save, and they were getting rebooted, and we didn't care. Now, I did that intentionally because, frankly, we needed to up-level very quickly. But that was a conscious, temporary, friction-oriented, we're going to pull everybody through a knothole. And then we started figuring out how to dial the friction back. Why? Because I didn't want to have to look over my shoulder walking to my car, considering all but again, there was that. But I'll give you another really good example. We had, again, public information. There was an employee who had stole a few $100 million of intellectual property from Intel. His name was Pawnee. You can look it up. Went to federal prison on it. After that event, and the individual had access to a top secret database. They were authorized and all that type of stuff. The audit ARs and the direction that I was getting from management and from various aspects of the compliance team was to make it harder to go get access to sensitive information. Well, if you look at it from a sales perspective, particularly in those type of environments, you need design information. You need the socket data for processors to go sell to a Dell or a Lenovo or somebody. That's sensitive information. It's intellectual property. It was registered, so you had to go retrieve it, ask for it, get it, all those type of things. And so there was a push to put more controls in place. Well, guess what? If you take a physical analogy and you go implement the equivalent of Fort Knox for data, what does that do? That means you've just slowed down the sales cycles. You just made it hard for a field application engineer to go work to design in a product to generate sales. That's directionally what I was told to do. I didn't do that. Why? Because that would have slowed the business. I said, what we need is to basically speed up stuff. And so we went and looked at the system and said, how many, and I'll be directionally correct, 4,000 people had access to it, requesting 4,000 times a month access to those sensitive documents for that sales purpose. Average time for approval was over a week. And it usually required multiple requests because the manager would be busy and forget and it would time out. Right? Okay. What I did is say, we're going to auto approve it. You've been given access to the system. you're authorized to get it as soon as you want, when you need it. And what I'm going to put in place is a detective control to look for unusual activities, for gathering stuff that doesn't seem to make sense, doing it in certain times of the day, doing it with other things that would indicate a potential insider risk. And guess what? I sped up the design in process and put a more appropriate control in place. Because by and large, all those requests were eventually approved anyways. They were just taking longer.
Yeah. That's a great example of evolution of controls, right? Because as you describe the problem, that's immediately what I kind of jumped to in my head of like, okay, well, approval process ensuring access. But the reality is it's not that, because it is an insider risk. And of course, what we really need is better detection of abnormal behavior, not normal behavior.
Exactly. There's another study that was done a couple years ago. I can't remember the medical association, but Vanderbilt University was with it. The dean of the Graduate School of Management had co-authored it with some medical officers and a few other people. And headlines read in the news, cybersecurity related incidents cost life and healthcare, something of that nature. I went and grabbed the study, looked at it, and you would think that it was the ransomware events a few years ago that were affecting the healthcare environment that was causing risk to patient care. Turns out that wasn't the case. It was the controls put in place post an event that slowed down critical care for people coming in with heart conditions, that increased the death rate by like 10 people for every 1,000 patients treated. Our controls created friction in a critical healthcare environment that cost lives.
That was my just a personal anecdote. I was at a hospital once with my wife when our children were coming into the world. And there was a nurse whose responsibility was to go around to every station and log in. I'm not going to name names, every 25 minutes, because of the control that said it had to be logged out every 30 minutes by default. And she never wanted a doctor to walk in the room and not have access to the computer as soon as they need it, when they needed it. But beautiful example of that kind of friction versus security and risk piece.
Yeah, because at that point, it's like I could care less about the confidentiality of my healthcare records. I care about the availability, one, and the integrity of it, two. Confidentiality, I don't give a shit about when I'm going in for a medical issue that's urgent.
It's a complicated space, and I'm glad that I'm not in that seat, to be sure. When you think about this, and particularly when you think about, I'm thinking about your use case with the sort of IP database back at Intel. The reality that we're seeing more and more often is it's not as conveniently located in a centralized database that you're managing on-prem. More and more often, it's out in the world in this sort of ephemeral SaaS estate that organizations are dealing with. How do you think this calculation of risk and friction has changed as sort of SaaS adoption has exploded and more organizations are using enterprise SaaS solutions for core parts of their business?
Yeah, well, again, that, like you said, that data store has created an urban sprawl that's everywhere. It certainly adds a complexity to not only where is the data and how do I assure the right person's accessing it on the right system that's protected in the right way, and in some cases in the right location, because there might be some geographical restrictions. There's a lot of complexity there. I think a lot of people have frankly thrown MFA and cloud related authentication capabilities in place to try and deal with that. But I say try because with my credit card, I could go get HubSpot. My credit card, I could go spin up a AWS instance. Or even if we have it as a, take a collaboration tool like Slack. I could create a Slack channel and include people external to the business that I don't have anything on. So you have, it becomes really hard. And what I see is it's not well managed. It's not well articulated in really the scope And so there has to be a better way to really understand that spread and then create the right, well, I'll say control environments that in some cases enable the user to make better choices, and in other cases allow you a level of control, and both need to occur.
It's interesting as you kind of talk about it that way, because when I think about this in the sort of categories of friction versus risk, there are some organizations that I've interacted with who make assertions like, "Hey, I've whitelisted the 5,000 domains my employees can go to on the internet," and of course, I would classify that as a high friction environment. But what's interesting in those environments is I don't think they've actually managed risk on the other side. What they've just done is driven the risk into less desirable behaviors. Okay, I'm going to access those sites on my phone, on my personal computer, on whatever it might be that supplements their work, console that's so heavily restricted.
You're 1,000% correct. Again, another true story. Yammer was launched in 2008, 2009, sometime a while ago.
Yeah, something like
I
that.
was one of the first 50 users at Intel on Yammer. And we were getting ready to do an earnings release. And, there's a lot of sensitive information. And then we always did these business update meetings, literally right after the earnings release. CEO would get on and do a live stream business update meeting and Q&A with employees. One of the employees who matrixed to me, who was also a part of the internal social media team and doing wikis and stuff, but was helping on security architecture, had blasted on an internal wiki, "Hey, let's all get on Yammer and chat about stuff during the business update meeting." Well, that got wind of the head of HR, the CEO, the general counsel. CIO pulls me out of a meeting and tells me, what was there. And I was like, "Oh yeah, I saw it." And he's like, Paul, who was the CEO at the time, wants you to shut off Yammer. And I'm like, "No, I'm not doing that." He's like, no, you don't understand. Paul told me to tell you, shut off Yammer. And I'm like, Paul doesn't know. I get why Paul's reacting that way, but I'm not doing that. And so really then the head of HR legal calls me and it's like, "You don't understand. We need to shut this off." And I was like, "No, you don't understand. People will pick up this. They'll do their tablet. They'll go on the guest network. It's a faux sense of control. What
Absolutely.
I need to do, which I already started doing, is I was participating in those Yammer groups. Why? Because culture's the strongest form of control. And if I can shape the path, my job as a risk manager is to be the biggest risk taker and be on the riskiest things first. Why? Because how do I know how to manage the risk if I'm not the first mover on the riskiest things? That's the thing that drives me nuts about the security team. You need to be the risk taker and be in front of the business on the riskiest things in order to figure out how to design the control environment for those three outcomes that I mentioned.
All right, Malcolm, here it comes. So, what do you think the riskiest thing that you're doing right now is?
Besides talking to you, no, just kidding. To be honest, it's a great question. Again, there's this whole thing on large language models, Chat GPT. Do you use them? Do you not use them? And all that type of stuff. I've played with that stuff. I'm not afraid of it. There's certain, I think, behaviors and awareness and things that we've got to, educate the users on. Maybe you put a splash screen instead of blocking it. You put a splash screen on the browser when somebody goes to one of those and says, "Hey, just recognize you're stepping off prim. You're going to go do this. Here's the equivalent 10 commandments. Here's the three things we're going to have you attest that you're not going to go do. You're not going to share intellectual property. You're not going to share personal information, whatever. Click accept. Great. Now you've just made me informed. You've made me risk aware. You've got documentation that you've done that. So if I screw up, you can fire me. Okay. You're enabling, I have a trademark on 3 words: protect to enable. That's what I believe our job is: protect to enable people, data, and the business.
That's a great way to frame it. When you think about kind of going forward from here, and certainly I appreciate your perspective on the emergent risk of generative AI. I kind of view that as more of like the most acute example of what people have been doing for years, right? Which is, there's some magic box on the other end of my web browser, and I'm giving it data, and I'm assuming something's happening and there's some protection around that data, but I'm not thinking a whole lot about it because there's some value I'm getting in return.
No
Or
different than when we first went to Google or Yahoo to search for something.
Yeah, exactly. And we've kind of gotten over the hurdle in a lot of other areas, but I think it's frankly a great way for people to kind of refocus on the reality of what people are doing in SaaS applications across the board. But what advice would you have for security leaders kind of looking to modernize their security program and kind of balance that risk versus friction as you very accurately described?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. One, set a design goal. You need to have a design goal at a macro level with the company. My design goal at Intel was no material or significant events. That framed everything we did, which also meant that depending upon the context, a high friction control might be required to hit the design goal. But if it's not a material or significant risk, why would you put in place a high friction environment? Right. So you can really start thinking about that. The other aspect, like when I got to Silence, that was the design goal. And the second design goal was only a nation state actor should ever be able to get in, and they have to work for it. Now I had alignment with the business around not only the level of risk that we were willing to accept, but also the threat actor we were willing to accept. And then my job was, again, to manage underneath that the risk dial, the total cost dial, and the friction dial. Because if I just implement friction and I generate people going around the business, guess what? I might create a material or significant event. Or I might create the ability for the threat actor that I want to have to work for it to make it easy because I just made an opening because the user went around a control. That's why I think when you think of this like a calculus equation and the optimization, you end up with a better answer for the business and a better answer for security.
I think that's a really mature way of thinking about those things. And it's obviously been thinking about it a lot over the years. We always used to, our back of the napkin was like, how secure you want to be. There's users doing stupid stuff, there's broad-based attacks, and then there's nation state actors. And it's sort of like, pick your poison. What do you need to get rid of today, right?
Yeah.
And that's always a challenge. Well, we could go on for hours, but it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining. And Malcolm, thank you so much for making time for us today. I really enjoyed talking to you. Stay tuned for future episodes of Overshadowed, and I hope you can join us again soon.